All right, I want to start this hour by telling you about an important position at the United Nations that has a very fancy-sounding title, but it has it for a good reason. The Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers. This is a job that monitors judicial independence around the world. The job literally exists to protect everyday people, and that is one of the first things would-be autocrats they try to do. They try to undermine the independence of the courts. They try to fire the judges who rule against you and replace them with loyalists. For years, the rapporteur's investigations focused on countries with some of the world's worst records on human rights and the rule of law. Afghanistan, where women have been barred from serving as judges. Belarus, where defense lawyers have been jailed. Zimbabwe, where independent judges have faced intimidation and threats. But this week, the United States became the subject of one of those investigations. On Thursday, Special Rapporteur Margaret Satterthwaite issued a formal communication criticizing the United States over the dismissal of immigration judges. In just a few moments, we will speak with Margaret Satterthwaite, for an exclusive interview on this new damning report. Because regardless of where you fall politically, it is remarkable that the United States is now being scrutinized by the same United Nations office that has long investigated repressive regimes. Here is what she found. Since January 2025, at least 135 immigration judges have been terminated. Many received an email with no explanation, no allegation at all of misconduct, just a notice informing them that the Attorney General had decided to remove them. Here's the thing. Immigration courts are different from the federal courts most Americans are familiar with. They are not part of the judicial branch. They are administrative courts housed inside the Department of Justice. And that means the same government prosecuting a deportation case also employs the judge that's deciding the case. And that structure has existed for decades. Critics have long argued that it leaves immigration judges vulnerable to political pressure. But for years, immigration judges had an important safeguard. They had civil service protections. They generally couldn't be fired without cause, without a reason. Then the Trump administration removed the lone Democratic member of something called the Merit Systems Protection Board, the panel that hears a lot of those federal employment disputes. That board then ruled that immigration judges can be fired at will. So that safeguard is gone. And according to the UN experts, the dismissals were not random. Judges who granted asylum at rates above the national average were disproportionately removed. They got 86th. So were judges with backgrounds representing immigrants or humanitarian organizations. And so were judges appointed by the previous administration. Entire courts now have actually gone dark, shuttered. The San Francisco Immigration Court was once staffed by 21 judges. It's shut down. Across 9 states, more than a dozen immigration courts have lost over half of their judges. So here's what that means. According to the National Association of Immigration Judges, every single judge who leaves behind an immigration courtroom leaves around 700 pending cases with them. Those cases end up reassigned, and now remaining judges are responsible for something like 10,000 to 12,000 cases. But if you think this affects only judges appointed by Democratic presidents, meet Judge Bray Burgee. She served on the immigration bench in Denver. That's her. She was appointed during President Trump's first term after spending more than a decade working in the immigration system, much of it representing the government. And then late last year, she granted bond to a Colorado mother and an outspoken Trump critic who has spent 9 months in ICE detention. Judge Burgee ruled that the government had failed to meet its burden to justify their continued detention. You know what happened? An ICE spokesperson publicly labeled the Republican appointee an activist judge. Soon afterward, a federal district court ruled that detained immigrants were entitled to bond hearings. The Justice Department ordered judges to ignore the federal court, but Burgee followed the court ruling. She returned to the bench, she switched on her microphone, and she announced on the record that she would continue holding those hearings. Days later, her detained docket was stripped away and it was reassigned. Other judges reversed her decisions, and then she was disciplined. And this June, while she was touring the East Coast with her 2 kids to celebrate America's 250th birthday, she got the call. She was terminated. effective immediately. She didn't even get a reason. Now consider what is replacing judges like Burgee. The administration launched a recruitment campaign seeking lawyers to become what it called not immigration judges, but deportation judges. Remember what is at stake in these courtrooms. Immigration judges decide whether a person will be allowed to remain in the United States or sent back to a country where they may face persecution, imprisonment, or even death. Maybe they haven't even been there before. And this is the part that we should all be paying attention to. The reason this story matters far beyond immigration, authoritarian governments rarely begin by stripping everybody's rights at once. They start with groups who have the least power and the fewest defenders, and they bet that nobody's going to care or pay attention. And once our society or any society accepts those departures from the rule of law, the tactics then they start to expand. If this playbook works on the immigration courts, nothing says that it's going to stop there. Judge Burgee put it this way: it's not just one court system that is being attacked. I think everyone has an interest in making sure that our systems function correctly. And if the immigration court doesn't, what's the next court not to function correctly? Will it be Social Security courts? Will it be the EEOC? People aren't going to be able to get justice when their due process rights are violated. She is pointing to something much bigger than immigration. Due process is not some hard-to-understand technicality. It's not some abstract academic thing. It is one of the oldest and most fundamental promises in American law, that the government cannot take your liberty, it cannot take your livelihood, it cannot take your life without proving its case before a neutral judge. And that's exactly why the United Nations monitors judicial independence all around the world. And that is why its findings this week deserve the attention of every American, not just those who care about immigration. The strength of a democracy is not measured by how it treats the wealthy or the well-connected, or certainly by Donald Trump's allies. It is measured by whether the person with the least power can still expect the law to protect them equally. Joining us now for an MS Now exclusive is Margaret Satterthwaite, the United States Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. She is also a professor of law at New York University. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you being here.
It's wonderful to join you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
This is an incredible report, and it is shocking. I think it shocks the conscience, as some courts have said, about this administration's immigration policy, because if you're not paying close enough attention, it does feel like we're talking about a foreign country. And in this country, though, incoming administrations, Democrats and Republicans, they've always put their stamp on the immigration system. What is it exactly that convinced you and your team that something more troubling or sinister or just frankly off was happening here in the United States?
So we, of course, received reports from some of the immigrant rights advocates looking at the problem from very early on in the Trump administration. And so we were following this a bit. But as you mentioned in your introduction, we have a lot of countries to cover around the world. And we weren't seeing a super alarming pattern until we started to look at the data itself. So we did some analysis of the data and were able to find exactly the patterns that you mentioned, that, for example, the judges who were being mass removed had 4 specific things that really showed who they would be, who was being targeted. First, they often had higher asylum grant rates. Second, they often had a background in immigrant defense or in legal aid. Third, they may have been appointed by President Obama or President Biden. Mm-hmm. And then fourth, they often were probationary judges, so they were easier to fire. This pattern convinced us to start talking with immigration judges, both on the bench now and those who had been dismissed. And talking to them really raised the alarm, because we heard about a whole pattern of attempts to influence and intimidate, really. I think I can use that word after having collected numerous testimonies. Wow. Intimidate these judges who remained.
Your experts have documented all kinds of changes that sound mundane, but they've got serious consequences. Like, for example, there's a calendar that prevents judges from setting hearings more than 6 months out. They're making it harder for immigrants to find lawyers. I guess what I'm trying to say is this what the erosion of due process actually looks like? Not just one big dramatic event shutting down the courts specifically and all at once, but a series of these smaller administrative tweaks that can be, I guess, overlooked if you're not looking close enough.
Absolutely. Exactly. So it's a capture of the court by getting rid of some judges, putting in new judges, and then really constructing a system where judges are constrained in their daily activities. So as you mentioned, the calendar really matters, right? Because a judge needs to have the discretion to give the parties enough time to collect evidence, to collect testimony, documents. And if they can't schedule out far enough, they are actually limiting the due process right of that individual. Another example is this use of something that the judges call mega master calendars. These are the scheduling calendar meetings that judges hold at the outset of a case. They have been asked and essentially required to do hundreds of these altogether. And that means, for example, if an immigrant comes before this judge without a lawyer, ordinarily, the judge would have time to ask the immigrant, can they get a lawyer? Can they sort of, make sure that they have the representation they need? In these mega masters, it's impossible for the judge to go through each of the cases individually.
Right.
And what that means is a lot of these individuals are getting deported more quickly, and they may even have a deportation order placed against them in absentia, so without them even being present, which again is something that we see in authoritarian countries around the world.
I was going to ask you about sort of some of the similarities between authoritarian countries, particularly like when you talk to the judges and what you were hearing from them. What are the parallels, other parallels that you've heard about authoritarian regimes?
Yes. So one of the key things is capturing the courts, and we've already talked about that. Another is intimidating judges. So the fact that ICE officers are circulating within these court areas, including sometimes going into the courtrooms, it's extremely intimidating. And not only to the folks who are coming before the judges, but to the judges themselves. And some of these judges talked about highly intimidating interactions with ICE officials. So that's another example. And then this kind of administrative manipulation of the judicial calendar and docket, that's a classic by authoritarians because it seems legal. It seems like maybe it's just to make things go more smoothly. But actually, if you look into it, what you see is it manipulates and limits what I would call curb. It curbs the ability of the courts to protect the very rights that they're meant to be protecting.
I wanted to pick back up, asking you about the judge that I had mentioned earlier, the Trump-appointed judge, Judge Bergey, who was an immigration judge appointed during President Trump's first term. She and some others warn that this playbook could extend to other immigration judges. She cited the Social Security courts and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Your thoughts on how far this could go?
I think she's absolutely right. And as you said, often authoritarians will attack the most vulnerable individuals in a society and use their success in that space to move on. So here we have not only a structurally compromised system because it's under the executive branch, but we also have a system that's dealing with one of the most hotly contested issues, using, of course, a lot of negative rhetoric, both against the judges and then also against those individuals who come before them, immigrants who are seeking to advance their cases. So once they figure out what tools work here, they could easily take those tools and use them exactly and especially with other administrative law judges. So these are judges who are not protected by Article 3 of the Constitution. They don't have the kind of protection of life tenure. They don't have guaranteed salary. So I'm very concerned about this. Let me just also say, lest we think that the Article 3 judges are perfectly safe, I do think there are some dangers for them as well that would be worth thinking about.
Why?
So first of all, we see direct and very vociferous attacks by high-level political officials, including the president himself, but also including some of his appointees, directly targeting individual Article 3 judges when they make decisions that the administration doesn't like. That they do it not only in language that would be acceptable around a disagreement with a case, they do it by targeting the individual judges, often labeling them or denigrating them personally. That's the first thing. Second, what you have to remember is the judiciary itself, the Article 3 judges, depends still on the executive for certain things. One of the most important things is judicial security. So the U.S. Marshal Service, which provides security to our regular judges, is under the executive department. Secondly, even courthouses. We think of courthouses as they must be controlled by the judiciary. But in fact, they're rented to the judiciary by the executive. These are the kind of administrative kind of vulnerabilities, I would call them, that I've seen in other countries used and exploited to really take over and pressure judges.
You have studied this all over the world, which is in particular why I was so excited to talk to you about this. How far along in the United States are we in the authoritarian playbook?
This is a really hard question to answer. I would say that it depends on which piece of the puzzle you're looking at. But what we do see in the judicial space is picking up of a lot of the tools in that toolbook. So the denigration that I mentioned, the real capture and curbing of the courts in the immigration system, and then this thinking about how can we utilize our power further to really bring some of these judges under our control. And I just want to say also, we are much more vulnerable than we would have thought we were, say, a year ago, even because of the Supreme Court's decisions. The one you mentioned that said that immigration judges can be just dismissed at will, but also because of exactly, and also because of the more recent case that said that the executive has control over all sorts of executive appointments. And so we don't know how far that could go. And I'm very, very concerned and alarmed that it could be used in this setting.
Well, this work that you have done is shocking. Hopefully not a harbinger of things to come, but it certainly sounds like it very well may be. I'd love to keep in touch with you on this and not just obviously follow your work around the world, but here in the United States. Margaret Satterthwaite, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. So grateful that you came to join us on Connect this morning. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time. I think it's so important for all of us to be watching out for what's happening here. So thank you for shedding this important light.